to Kiss Crafting 101. So in the last video, we went over how to ink up our stamps and get a good impression. Now that we know how to stamp a great image, what do we do with that image? How do we incorporate it into a card? And one of my favorite beginner compositions is what I like to call the front and center layout. Anytime you look at a composition, your eye immediately looks for somewhere to land. It looks for a landing place or somewhere to start. The front and center makes that starting point or that landing place very obvious. So I use this a lot in my design because I tend to focus more on the image. I always start with my focal point first and then I work my way out. So as you can see here in a couple examples, it works with a variety of images and applications. In each of these cards, it's very obvious what the viewer should be looking at. Whether it's portrait or landscape, all of the attention is drawn to the focal point and it's taking center stage.
Let's start by covering some of the basics of creating the card base. You'll want to start with a good heavyweight cardstock. Anywhere from 80 to 110 pounds is great for a card base. The standard size for a handmade card is A2, which is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, and this is because you can get 2 card bases from one 8 1/2 by 11 inch sheet of cardstock by cutting it down the center either vertically or horizontally. To do our cutting, we're going to use a paper trimmer. I highly recommend investing in one. I've had this one for 13 years and it's still going strong. To create 2 top fold card bases, you're going to cut the card down the center vertically. When using the paper trimmer, the best thing is to consider the cutting blade 0. That would be your starting point. So here we would start at 0, measure the card over 4 1/4 inches, and then just cut down the center. That gives us 2 top fold card bases. To create a side fold card base, you're going to cut down the center what would be horizontally. We're going to measure over 5 1/2 inches for this one because that's the center of the cardstock. So start at 0 and then measure your card over to the 5 1/2 inch mark and then just cut down the center. We now have 2 side fold card bases. Since we're using a nice heavyweight cardstock, this is 100-pound here, this is our oatmeal cardstock, you're going to want to score it first. You'll measure over to the center, which is 5 1/2 inches for the standard A2 top fold card, score it, and then fold it. Now this is going to prevent any of that cracking or wrinkling that would occur if we tried to fold it without scoring it first. For a side fold card, you're going to measure over to the center, which is 4 1/4 inches, score it, and fold it. This is going to give us a nice crisp fold. Now sometimes when you're using heavy cardstock, even after you've scored it, it may not want to lay completely flat. A trick is to take a bone folder and run it across the fold. This will further reinforce that fold and help your cardstock to lay completely flat. Now this is especially helpful if you're doing a one-layer card. It will keep that cardstock from lifting up towards you and prematurely hitting your stamp. Now that our card base is done, it's time to bring it front and center. I'm starting off with my focal panel, which I've cut down to 4 1/2 inches by 3 1/4 inches. For our focal image, I'm going to be using the large poinsettia from our Pretty Poinsettia stamp set. I'm stamping this in our Cupid's Bow pigment ink onto our oatmeal cardstock. You'll see here that I'm actually going to stamp it off onto scratch paper first, just to make sure that I have even ink coverage and that there's no debris or anything on my stamp. Now this set is a multi-step stamp set, and today we're going to be using 2 of the layers. Now each layer has this little tab on the side which will help assist with lining up each layer as you stamp them. So here I'll remember that that tab is off to the right, so when I go to stamp the next layer, I can start with the stamp in the exact same position. Next we're going to be adding the centers to the poinsettia. So another good trick is if you're not sure what color you want to use or if you even want to add something to a project, test it off on your scratch paper first. Here I'm using Old Olive by Stampin' Up! And I decided that I liked the second generation stamping of it better, so I've gone ahead and stamped it off once on the scratch paper and now I'm adding it to my project. This is a great way to test out your options before committing, and that way you don't have to start all over if you decide you don't like it. For the very center, I wanted to try a little bit of a rock and roll technique, but I wasn't sure if I was going to like it. So I'm testing it off on the side here first. And I've decided that I do want to use it. So I'm going to zoom in here so that you can see what I'm doing. I'm first inking it up in Stampin' Up! Summer Sunrise, and then I'm rolling the edges of the stamp on the Old Olive ink pad. And this just creates, it goes from yellow to kind of a chartreusey green to a darker green on the edges. So here I'm going to show you one more time. I just roll it around in the Old Olive and then I'm going to stamp it in the center. Here you can see that I'm trying to line it up and then I realize I've got it upside down. So I flip it over and stamp it. Now it's time to add some leaves peeking out from behind the poinsettia. Also included in the set is this grouping of leaves. Now you can't just stamp them down all together. They won't fit that way. But I felt that connecting them all together was better than having all of these separate little stamps because there's filler images like the shadow and the veins, and it would be hard to tell once you got all of those separate images what went with what. So here I've just grouped them all together on one stamp, and they're far enough apart that you can ink them up separately and stamp them individually. So I'm just going to add those around the edges and have a few peeking here and there using the same Old Olive ink by Stampin' Up! And when adding leaves to a flower, it's always, it's like a no-fail to go in a triangle. So I'm just adding that last little leaf up here in the corner. And this is just a surefire way to create balance. To add a little bit of interest to the flower, I'm using the detail layer that's also included in this set. Now, my head is going to get in the way here in just a second, and I apologize. I'm trying to look directly over without putting my head in the camera, but, I failed. Now, we're stamping this in the exact same color, the Cupid's Bow Pigment ink, but because we let the first layer of ink dry, the second layer is going to be much more intense and vibrant. Had we stamped it wet on wet, they would have kind of melded together as they dried, and it wouldn't be as noticeable. This is a great way to stretch your ink stash. To add a little bit of details to the leaves, we're going to be using the veins that are included in the set. Now the poinsettia also has a vein stamp image as well, but for this particular one, since this is Keep It Simple stamping, I thought we'd do a slow introduction to the multi-step stamping. So here I'm showing you two each. So we've got the base layer and then the detail layer, and then we have the base layer for the leaves and the vein layer. And this just goes to show that even if it's a multi-step stamp set, you can use as few or as many of the layers as you want. It's really up to you and how detailed and realistic you want this image to look. So when it came time to add the sentiment, I wasn't sure what color I wanted to do it in. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it in the red, the green, or the brown because I knew I was going to mat this on craft. So here's another trick that I sometimes do, and I'm going to stamp out the sentiment in a couple different colors, and then I'm just going to cut it out and lay it over the card and see which color I like best. So this is a great trick, and I use this a lot when I'm unsure of what color to stamp the sentiment. And either of these would work, the red or the brown. But I've decided since I'm using a craft mat, the brown is going to pull that craft into the card, and it's going to allow the poinsettia to remain the star of the card. It's not going to compete with the poinsettia for attention. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut down my craft mat, and my focal panel is 4.5 by 3 1/4. So I'm going to add a 1/4 inch to each of those and cut it at 4 3/4 by 3.5 inches. And that should give me the perfect mat for my focal panel. So now I'm just going to test out one more time and make sure that I'm happy now that I've got my mat in place with my choice. And I've actually decided I was going to stamp this directly on the focal panel, but I decided I kind of like it in the strip. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this down and add the whole strip to the card. So we're going to keep this card all flat. It'd be great for a mailable holiday card. So we're just going to use our tape runner to adhere our focal panel down to our mat. And here you'll see that the first time I go to stick this down, I was only looking at two corners here. I was looking at the left side and the top, and that gave me an uneven placement. So I am going to take it off here, and now I'm going to use the left and right side as well as the top. Since I know I trimmed these out to exact sizes, if those three are perfectly spaced and centered, then I know the fourth side is going to be centered as well. Then I just adhered the focal panel directly to the card base using a tape runner, and the sentiment directly to that using a tape runner as well. So I felt like it still needed a little something, so I decided to try some stickles. I wasn't quite committed to the idea yet, so I decided that I would try it out on my test impression that I had over here first. Because I'm using my test impression, I can try out different variations, see if I like it better with a little or a lot, or if I even want any at all. After trying this on my test impression, I felt that less is more in this case. I was really ready to just start loading on the stickles, but decided instead to just hint at the veins that would be showing through in the petals, and I think that that added enough to this card to make the poinsettia stand out without overpowering it. So there you have the front and center layout. This can be adapted to any card style, from clean and simple to shabby chic. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you decide to create your own, don't forget to share it on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, and tag it with hashtag W+9. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.